Good morning. You are listening to WXOX 97.1 FM in Louisville, Kentucky, or perhaps you are streaming on artxfm.com through our website or the app on your phone. This is LVA's Artebella on the radio. My name is Keith Waits. I'm your host, and the show is produced by Louisville Visual Art. And once again, Louisville Visual Art will be participating in the Louisville Photo Biennial, which is really now underway. Some of the shows are open and in September, and that'll run all through October. And just go to LouisvillePhotoBiennial.com. You'll get all the information you need to know. Today, our special guest is Keith Carter. He's an internationally respected author, educator, and workshop leader. He has published 13 books of his expressive images. In addition, 2 documentary films have been released: Keith Carter, The Artist Series, and Ted Forbes and a Certain Alchemy, Anthropy Arts. A 50-year retrospective book was released in the fall of 2019 from University of Texas Press. Carter has been described as a poet of the ordinary by the Los Angeles Times and received the Texas Medal of Arts in 2009. Mr. Carter's work is included in numerous private and public collections, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the National Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the J. Paul Getty Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the George Eastman House, and the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University. That's a mouthful, and I could have gone on and said more, but Keith Carter, thank you for being with me.
Well, it's nice to be with you, Keith. Thank you.
First off, I think I know the answer to this question, but let's start off with, are you a native Texan?
No, my family moved here when I was 3. I was actually born in Madison, Wisconsin, so I claim to be a pretty much a Texan.
Well, but that explains the dialect. You sound like a Texan.
Well, I also live on the Texas-Louisiana border. We're just 30 miles from Louisiana, so the vernacular speech creeps in all the time. So
how does it? So does it break down? You know, like a lot of places, you know, there is no one accent for a state. So where you are, is there a word for the kind of accent a Texan has in your part of the state?
Cajun-esque.
Cajun-esque.
Yes, okay. Something along those lines. I never quite understood that, but nonetheless, we hear it a lot.
Okay. Well, so I'm going to start with, you know, I'm always interested to know why people wind up doing a certain kind of thing as an artist. Like, how do they get to that medium? So what was it that drew you to photography?
Well, I grew up for the most part in a single parent household, and my mother was a photographer at a time when it was difficult for a single woman to be a photographer in a small to medium-sized town. So part of it was her influence, and I'd go after school, elementary school, I'd go to her studio rather than go home and hang out there. So those kinds of things. Also, I met a sculptor who's 93 today, but I met him when I was 5 years old, and his name is David Cargill. And he's been a huge influence on me for most of my life, certainly all of my adult life. He lives the life of a true artist, and he had a great interest in photography. He also had a darkroom, so I would in the early days work over there.
What was your first camera?
My first camera was a little Nikon that I inherited from my stepdad, and it was a wonderful thing. I wanted to be Henri Cartier-Bresson, like most men and women of my generation. Just absolutely was mesmerized by his work, and I was probably 19 at that point. So it was a good start, and he was a good unwitting mentor, you know.
Are you shooting much with a single lens reflex now, or because I see what looks like a very beautiful 8x10 view camera there behind you?
Oh yes. Well, to answer your question, yes, I do, and I use a variety of formats. I still use a film 35 millimeter single lens reflex. I use digital. I use 8x10 cameras. I do historical processes. Mostly, I use the one behind me for wet plate. Which is a 1860s process, which I won't bore you with, but you know, you needed a large negative.
Right. Well, we can get into process a little bit, but So I've spent some time looking at your images. And by the way, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about this later, but I guess I just want to say up front, like we're talking to you in this particular instance because you were giving the keynote address in the Louisville Photo Biennial. And that's why. So you're about to come to town. You're about to come visit us, and which is great. But I think that in general, a lot of the first approach people have to photography is to imagine that it just captures the world in the way that we see it. And that I think artists are maybe reminding us how subjective, in other words, the camera is a fairly objective tool, but that it's actually very subjective. I look at a lot of your work and I don't see a lot of your work that simply does that. What is there one sort of aesthetic objective you have in how you approach what you're trying to achieve with your images?
Well, in a nutshell, I try to make images, photographs that are externally objective, but internally boundless. I like to make images that have multiple meanings. I prefer to work in the, we'll call it the real world, as opposed to the digital world, although I'm fascinated and work with digital media all the time. It's not the constructed imagery is not what I care to do. Right. So it's a big, beautiful, wide-ranging world out there, and there are a lot of viewpoints. And it's like Willie Nelson once said, I heard him on his bus once, somebody asked him about his melodies. He said, yeah, you know, the themes are pretty much the same, but where do your melodies come from? And he said, well, they're up in the air. They're all around me. I just reach up and grab one. And of course, Willie was doing Willie stuff at that time. And but he meant that, and that's how he thought. So I can relate in some modest ways.
Well, it does seem like, and again, I spent some time looking at your work, but there's a lot of work there, a lot of different kinds of images, and it may represent different time periods in your career. I'm not sure. And that's what I want to ask you. Do you tend to get into a certain sort of image or series or approach and work through it until you feel like you've sort of explored it as much as you can? Or do you find yourself working with different kinds of images and maybe going back and forth between different sorts of pulls?
Well, the former definition, the way you explained it, I'm existentially restless by nature, and I found it beneficial, at least for my own type of work, to work on what I call projects. And I generally give myself 2 to sometimes 3 years to finish a project. It's kind of like a writer doing a novel, but in my world, a project consists of 60 to 80 coherent, intelligent photographs. And it takes me about 2 years to finish them. But that said, it gives me blinders on what I should be doing and how I should be spending my time. It's a technique that's been helpful to me, or a way of working that's been helpful to me. I also teach in a university, so I have a full-time professorship. So,
do you find yourself? Do you ever like work for the purpose of your teaching? Are you ever doing certain kinds of images or certain kind of techniques strictly for the reason to teach them, or are you or do you not do that as an artist?
Well, I do a little bit of that now, particularly since we're in the digital age, which is miraculous. So I will make specific examples to teach that kind of program. And in the darkroom, we still teach darkroom courses, and you make images for the purpose that you just spoke of, for teaching purposes. But with regard to my own work, I'm pretty democratic. You know, I look at everything and just try to find multiple meanings sometimes.
You talk about the darkroom wet chemistry work. You know, there are people who would tell me that's over, you know, like you shouldn't teach that to high school or college level students anymore because it's over. And clearly you would disagree with that. You're still teaching that.
Well, I find that an ironic statement because my experience is if you introduce young freshmen to the darkroom, half the time they almost wet their pants with excitement. I mean, they're excited about the whole physical process. They grew up with the digital world. They're pretty adept at that, but to work with running water, orange moonlight, to use, you know, beautiful papers and precious metals and arcane chemistry. If they're introduced to it properly, my experience is they find it pretty fascinating. So I do both. And I don't know a living photographer that doesn't now use the digital world, you know, including people in my age bracket, that kind of thing. And I find that equally fascinating, you know, angels on the head of a pin. But I like the physicality of the wet darkroom, as we call it.
Well, I did photography in my college days too. And I, you know, to me, I think there's something magic about not quite knowing what you've got. I mean, you can shoot it, you can develop the negative, but until you're in that tray, you don't really see the image. And having to go through that process, there's something magical, not to get too you know, goofy about it, but there's something magical about having it only come to you at that point.
It is magical, and it's a wonderful word, and it's totally explanatory. It's you just feel like Merlin at some in some aspects. So, but I find the digital world the same. I find it fascinating and allows me to do things that I wouldn't be able to do in the film-based world. For instance, the digital world is much more forgiving for nighttime photography. If you're interested in that heavy chiaroscuro nighttime work. Plus, in the color printing world, in the darkroom, for decades, when I would print color, if you shifted one color, you shifted all the colors. You couldn't target a specific color. So if it was a portrait, you printed for the skin tones, and whatever the other colors fell, they just fell that way. But in the digital world, it's remarkable. You can target a specific color and change that. So you have much more control. But it's really not so much about the technology in my experience at this point. It's really about what do you find interesting in the world? What is it you wish to spend your time working on or evolving? It's kind of like writing a little short story or a novel. How do you want to spend your time? And what are you disposed to think about?
So what are you disposed to think about at this moment in your career as an artist?
Well, I have a new book coming out, and I have 6 more weeks for my deadline is upon me. And it's just been a wonderful and invigorating thing. And I've been working on a landscape project, which I haven't really done in years. And it's black and white, and it's on swamps and bogs, fens and bay galls and wetlands. Again, it's monochromatic rather than color. And it's been fascinating. I'm not so much interested in the ecological overtones of it all as I am the sort of mysteries that are found within those strange arcane bodies of water. So I'm wading around in waders and hip boots and ruining tripods and then trying all kinds of things. So that's currently what I've been doing for the last 2 years.
And so you said you have a deadline on the book, then the book would probably be ready in how long?
Well, this is with the University of Texas Press, and the way that works, to make a long story short, is you really need to finish all the material roughly 8 months ahead of publication,
Okay.
because they're generally printed overseas, and they come on the proverbial slow boat from China back to the United States when they're bound and printed. So I have a November 1st for a fall 2022 release date.
Okay. All right. Well, very good. We'll be sure and look for that.
Well, thank you.
Something else I noticed looking through your images that I find often in the work of a lot of other photographers. There's much of your work that is very clearly photography, and then but there are also and your website does a very good job of breaking things down into, I guess, project names or periods of, I don't know exactly how you assign the names, but there's a lot of different subcategories there. And like I say, you could spend many, many hours. And I'll take this a moment to remind people that looking at somebody's website is always terrific, but it does not compare to looking at the work in a gallery, museum, or possibly even a very beautifully printed book. But it's important to be in the space. But like there's one series in particular, or one called "To Build an Ark," and I was looking through those, and I'd looked through a bunch of different sections, and everything was black and white. I think these were the first images I got to where you were using color, and I was looking at them, and they were astonishing. But one of the things is that many of those images, I had to ask myself, is that a photograph? It started to sort of blur the lines of the technology or to identify it as a photograph. It sometimes seemed like it was a painting or maybe even some sort of a print. When things like that happen, is that something you're intentionally trying to do to sort of blur those lines, or is that just something that happens more organically from the image you're pursuing?
Well, it's a good question. And the short answer is I'm trying to blur the lines. But that particular project, I got interested in the Anthropocene that we're living in and the ecological aspects of things. But it's also was my first serious foray into using digital media for my own work. Even though I taught it, I didn't use it that much. And it's, again, an example of being able to target specific colors and change them. I got interested in much more subdued tones, aside from the esoteric subject matter, having to do with ecology and living things on the earth, as well as our place in it and how we're handling ourselves, and all of the ensuing problems. And so it was mostly an experiment, and I'm very fond of those images, but everything was, nothing was actually constructed. But I did use, I made some wet plate textures, and I scanned those textures, and sometimes I would overlay a texture on top of an unadorned image to see what it would do and see how it broke up the space and what it would do emotionally to the whole photograph. So long story short here, it was an experimental project that I remain very fond of. So it was my first serious color thing.
Do you ever experiment and find yourself not very fond of the images and just put stuff away?
Yes, and it's always a little bit of a downer, but you have to try things. You just have to try things. Like I said, I'm a bit restless sometimes, and the last thing I want to be doing is the same kinds of work over and over and over. There are certain motifs and certain beliefs we have as adults that and interests, and in mine, some of those remain the same, and but I'm a big fan of historical processes, and I'm a big fan of contemporary media, and it's just a wonderful way to spend time to try to bring the two of them together.
So when you talk about the historical processes, I guess I'm wondering, is there some sort of a intersection between that interest in historical processes and the experimentation with new processes?
Well, yes, and for me, it's a physical thing. You really have to try and put the two things together, and you can do that on a computer, and sometimes, or you can do that in the darkroom, but the physical manifestation is the print.
Mhm.
So at least in my world, not the screen. So you print these things one way or another, and then sometimes you embellish the surfaces of the paper themselves. I try to make photographs that look like photographs, not paintings or etchings or any other process. And I love the whole cachet that the word photography comes from the Greek, and it means writing or drawing with light. And that's kind of a spiritual as well as a physical thing to me. So
Now you are coming to Louisville here pretty soon. Let's see, for the 2021 Photo Biennial. And I'm just looking at their calendar, making sure here that your speech, you were on September 24th, the keynote event, which is at the Speed Art Museum at 6 p.m. on Friday, September the 24th. What, I don't want you to tell me the address, but what's on your mind? What do you think is important for photographers to know right now in this point in time? What's important to photography in America?
Well, I think it's important to note that we stand on the shoulders of giants, men and women in the history of photography who have made some of the world's greatest works of art under the world's most unfavorable, capricious conditions. And I want to talk a little bit about the history, not too much. I want to talk about how my work has evolved, but I know the dangers in the me talk. I get tired of those myself. And then I want to try and bring the two together to talk about the future and where we might be going. And I want to show some other people's work besides my own that I think are useful for any students who are forced to come to that talk for extra credit, that kind of thing. So, and it's peculiar times, we all know, with the pandemic raging around us. So, so I have a threefold plan in mind: history, myself, and the future.
Well, it occurs to me when you talk about that standing on the shoulders of giants, is that connection to working with the wet chemistry darkroom a way to stay in touch with those giants and the way that they did photography?
Well, I hadn't thought about it like that, but the answer would be yes. Certainly. I really revere, and I love the way they look. Some of these early prints, if you see them in various museums, particularly in black and white, it's a poor misnomer for the actual tonalities of some of those early processes. And so it's like calling a mockingbird a mockingbird. If you've ever heard one sing, they ought to call it like a holy bird, or it's, you know, it's just fascinating. So all those things run rampant through my mind.
I think I can't help but think about, you know, again, touching base with my very limited experience in the darkroom too, is that there's a lot of things that the giants, the masters of the past, did that sometimes they came to through experimentation or even accidents that occurred in the darkroom. And I personally wonder, like, does the digital world give us that same opportunity for stumbling into something wonderful that the physical process does?
Yes, I think so. And I think that creativity in whatever art form people choose is as important as literacy and should be treated with the same importance. And I think that we have to learn to love the gift of the human imagination. And the other thing I love, and I have this written on my darkroom wall, I have a lot of stuff written on my darkroom wall, but The poet Wallace Stevens said once, poetry must almost successfully resist intelligence. It's that must almost that I love. And I changed the words to photography, or whatever art form you practice, must almost successfully resist intelligence. You have to trust your intuition. You have to know your history. You have to know whose shoulders you stand on. And you have to have a goal in mind. It helps to have an end plan. You know, I want to make 25 photographs or 25 pages in my novel by this date. Otherwise, at least in my small part of the art world, you know, you just end up wasting a lot of time, which is pretty precious to me.
Well, I just wanted to ask one final question, or just to note that in your biography, there's a list of some of the private collections that are celebrities, and it's quite a list of celebrities. And I was just noticing a few. I mean, I won't go through all the names, but like I was just noticing Vanessa Redgrave, for example, has one of your photographs. Have you been able to, like, have you ever dealt personally with those kinds of collectors? I mean, are those celebrities serious photography collectors?
Well, many of them are, and in Vanessa Redgrave's situation, yes, she came to one of my openings. Actually, it was here in Texas. She was making a film down here. And that's how that all evolved. But frankly, no, I don't hang out generally with a lot of celebrities. I've met a number of them on occasion, but and I'm thrilled, you know, when they collect my work. But that's not a normal occurrence to me.
Well, I just wonder. I mean, because we do know, I've read some things about Elton John is quite a collector, has invested.
Huge collector, yeah.
I mean, someday he'll probably leave it to some museum, you know, or build the museum.
Yes.
with that kind of money.
Yes.
So it's just interesting. But Horton Foote is also on that list. So I was looking for, like, there's not a lot of Texas people, but no. I guess I don't always know if people are from Texas. They become famous and they live in some other place.
Yeah, but fortunately, but the largest collection of hundreds of my prints resides here in Texas at the Whitfield collection at Southwestern State University. So from my small part of the art world, that's a wonderful and relatively enduring thing. But the bottom line is nothing counts unless you do the work, you know. And if you're a student out there or you're my colleague, sometimes it's good to be reminded of that. You can talk till you're blue in the face, but nothing counts until you do the work. And that takes some structure in your life. That takes a little bit of your resources. It takes a lot of your emotional resources. And when it works, it's like angels on the head of a pin. It's just exciting. It's still exciting after 50 years. So.
Well, Keith Carter, I think we'll end on that note because I think that's a fine note to end on. Thank you so much for talking to me today. And just to say it again, September 24th, Keith Carter will be delivering the keynote address to the 2021 Louisville Photo Biennial. And we'll all see each other masked.
Yes.
The masks are interesting, but I guess they're not really very helpful to photographers.
Yes, masked. And I want to say it's been nice to talk to you, Keith. And I don't think I've ever had the pleasure of talking to another Keith under this kind of circumstance. So
really, you know, there's a few of them here. I'm part of a little Keith club in the arts community.
Well, see, I don't know that many Keiths, so it's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much, Keith.
Well, thank you for the talk.